Death has a way of showing you exactly how much your life was worth, and mine, apparently, was worth 30 years of emptiness and a final breath stolen by the man I loved unconditionally. But what if death wasn't the end? What if it was just the cruel setup for the most beautiful revenge? I remember the exact moment my world shifted, not when I died. Gasping for air as Lucalu pulled my oxygen tube free with those cold, calculating eyes. But when I opened them again to see the same ivory dress hanging in my closet, the same nervous energy crackling through my 22-year-old body, the same date circled in red on my calendar, October 15th, our engagement day. The day that had destroyed my entire existence was now my second chance. The silk of my engagement dress felt different this time, not like a promise, but like armor. I could still feel the phantom weight of 52 years pressing against my chest. The memory of 3 decades spent in an empty house while my fiancé played devoted caretaker to his sister. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I had been reborn into the very moment that had sealed my fate, gifted with the knowledge of exactly how my sacrifice would be repaid. With betrayal, with abandonment, with murder. The morning light streaming through my bedroom window carried the same golden hue I remembered, but now it felt like stage lighting, illuminating the opening act of a completely different play. I could hear my mother's voice downstairs, that familiar nervous flutter as she arranged flowers for the ceremony, completely unaware that her daughter had lived an entire lifetime of regret. In what felt like a single, suffocating breath, I moved through my morning routine with the strange detachment of someone who had already lived this day, already made these choices, already suffered these consequences. The face in the mirror looked so young, so hopeful, so devastatingly naive. I wanted to shake her, to scream at her about what was coming, but she was me and I was her, and this time, I would make different choices. The Yamamoto family arrived, exactly at 11:30, just as they had before. Lucalu's mother clutched her pearls with the same nervous energy. His father carried the same bottle of expensive sake, and Lucalu himself wore that same charcoal suit that had always made my heart skip. But this time, I saw through the veneer. I saw the way his eyes darted to his phone, the barely concealed tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward the window that faced Milla's building dot in my first life. I had attributed his nervousness to pre-engagement jitters. How beautifully stupid I had been. Our families settled into the familiar choreography of formal pleasantries. My father discussing business with his father, our mothers comparing notes on the ceremony details, and Lucalu and I sitting side by side on the velvet sofa, playing the part of the devoted couple. His hand found mine with practiced ease, but now I could feel the lie in his touch, the way his fingers trembled not with love, but with the weight of his deception. I studied his profile as he nodded along to my mother's chatter about the floral arrangements, the strong jawline that I had once traced with reverent fingers, the dark eyes that had once looked at me like I was his entire world, the mouth that had whispered promises it never intended to keep. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are captivating until you realize they're poison. The moment arrived like clockwork, 12:47. I had memorized the time from my previous life, had watched it tick by on the grandfather clock in the corner while my world imploded. The distant sound of sirens began as a low wail, growing stronger, more urgent. I watched Lucalu's entire body go rigid, watched his hand slip from mine as his attention fixed on something beyond the window. The smell of smoke drifted in through the partially open window, acrid, urgent, carrying with it the promise of destruction. In my first life, this had been the moment where everything went wrong, where my concern for his safety had marked the beginning of my descent into a living hell. Lucalu shot to his feet so abruptly that conversation stuttered to a halt. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with panic that I now recognized had nothing to do with general concern for public safety. This was personal. This was about her. "There's a fire," he said. his voice barely steady, in the building across the street. I followed his gaze through the window and saw at the apartment complex where Mila Chen lived, where she had always lived, where she would continue to live like a spider in her web, spinning threads that would entangle us both. Smoke poured from the third floor, dark and thick against the afternoon sky. Fire trucks were already arriving, their red lights painting everything in apocalyptic hues. This was it, the moment of truth, the fulcrum upon which my entire existence had balanced. Lucala's phone buzzed, and I didn't need to see the screen to know who was calling. I had lived this before. I knew the script by heart. But this time, I wouldn't be playing my assigned role. He answered with shaking hands, and I could hear her voice through the speaker high, panicked, desperate. Lou, I'm trapped. The stairwell is blocked. I can't get out. Please, I'm so scared. The raw terror in her voice was real. I'll give her that. But I also knew what I hadn't known 30 years ago. That she had been the one to start the fire in the first place. A desperate bid for attention that had spiraled beyond her control. A game that had become a nightmare that had become my prison. Lucalu's face transformed in that moment, shifting from panic to determination to something that looked almost like relief. As if he had been waiting his entire life for permission to choose her over me. Mila, hold on. I'm coming. I'll get you out. He hung up and turned to face our families, his jaw set with resolve. I have to go. There's someone trapped in that building. His mother reached for his arm. Lucalu, the firefighters are already there. It's too dangerous. She's like a sister to me. He interrupted, and the light sliced through the air with surgical precision. I can't just stand here and do nothing. In my previous life, this had been the moment I had risen from the sofa, had grabbed his arm, had begged him not to go. I had been so afraid of losing him to the flames that I hadn't realized I was about to lose him to something far worse. My love had been my weakness. My fear had been my downfall. But not this time. This time, I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, and I smiled. Go quickly, I said, my voice steady and clear. If she means that much to you, then you shouldn't waste time. The shock on his face was almost comical. This wasn't the script we had followed before. This wasn't the Elena he knew, the woman who would sacrifice everything for his safety, who would carry the guilt of someone else's scars for 30 years, who would die alone and forgotten while he played saint to his true love. He stammered, clearly expecting resistance, expecting the familiar dance of protest and reassurance. I won't be long. Just until the firefighters can reach her. Of course, I replied, my smile never wavering. These things take time. The silence that followed was deafening. Both families stared at us, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic they thought they understood. Lucalu's mother looked between us with growing alarm. His father frowned deeply, and my own parents exchanged worried glances. But Lucalu was already moving toward the door, driven by a desperation that had nothing to do with brotherly concern, and everything to do with the opportunity he had been waiting for. The chance to be her hero, the chance to prove his devotion, the chance to make a choice that would define the rest of our lives. He paused at the threshold, looking back at me, with something that might have been confusion or might have been guilt. Elena, I go. I said firmly, she's waiting. And he did. He left without another word, without a backward glance, without even closing the door behind him. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs faded quickly, swallowed by the growing chaos outside. Through the window, I watched him sprint across the street toward the burning building, toward his destiny, toward the choice that would finally, definitively, show everyone exactly who he really was. The silence in the room stretched like a held breath. Both sets of parents sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. The sudden departure of the groom-to-be on his engagement day. The complete lack of protest from his bride. The door standing open like an accusation. I rose from the sofa with deliberate calm, smoothing down my dress as if nothing unusual had happened. "Please excuse me for a moment," I said to our stunned families. "I need to retrieve something from upstairs." My mother's voice followed me as I climbed the stairs to Lucala's childhood bedroom. "Elena, dear, what's happening? Where did he go?" I didn't answer. I had a performance to complete, and every moment of it had to be perfect. This was my one chance to rewrite the story, to ensure that the truth couldn't be buried under 30 years of lies and manipulation. Lucalu's bedroom was exactly as I remembered it, still decorated with the remnants of adolescence, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, still hiding secrets that I had discovered far too late in my previous life. I moved to his desk drawer with the confidence of someone who had already lived through the revelation, had already felt the crushing weight of discovery. The diary was exactly where I knew it would be, buried beneath old school papers and forgotten photographs, brown leather, worn at the edges, filled with years of confessions that he had never intended for anyone to see. And tucked between its pages, the photograph that had haunted my nightmares Mila Chen at 17, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, looking carefree and beautiful and completely unaware that she was the subject of an obsession that would destroy multiple lives. I held both items in my hands, feeling their weight like weapons. In my previous life, I had discovered these treasures. Much later, hidden away like guilty secrets while I struggled to understand why my husband seemed more married to his ward than to his wife. By then, it had been too late to matter. The patterns had been set. The choices had been made. The damage had been done. But now, I had the power of perfect timing. I descended the stairs slowly, savoring the moment, letting the anticipation build. Through the window, I could see Lucala's figure disappearing into the smoke-filled building. The fire trucks had arrived in full force. Firefighters were setting up their equipment, and crowds were gathering to watch the drama unfold. It was a perfect storm of chaos and heroics and public attention. Exactly what she had wanted. I entered the living room to find both families huddled around the window, watching the scene across the street with varying degrees of anxiety and confusion. Lucala's mother was wringing her hands, his father was pacing, and my own parents were whispering urgently to each other. "Where is he?" his mother asked the moment she saw me. "What's taking so long?" I smiled serenely and placed the diary and photograph on the coffee table between our families. The items landed with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I think these will explain everything. Lucala's father was the first to understand what he was looking at. His face went white, then red, then white again as he picked up the photograph with shaking hands. Mila's teenage face smiled up at him from the glossy surface, beautiful and damning. "What is this?" he whispered. "Open the diary," I suggested. Gently. "Start with the entry from 3 years ago. May 14th, I believe." His mother leaned over his shoulder as he found the page, and I watched their expressions change as they read their son's private thoughts. His obsession with Mila, his resentment toward our engagement, his elaborate fantasies about what their life could be if only he had the courage to choose her openly. The entry I had directed them to was particularly revealing. "Saw Mila at the cafe today. She looked so sad, so beautiful." I wanted to tell her everything, to confess how I felt since we were children. But Elena's family expects the engagement announcement soon. I'm trapped between duty and desire. Sometimes I dream that something would happen, an accident, an illness, something that would give me a reason to postpone the wedding without hurting anyone. Is it wrong to want a disaster if it means I could finally be free? My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Elena, perhaps we shouldn't be reading someone's private. Keep going." I interrupted softly. Page 47. The entry from last month. They flipped forward, and I saw the exact moment when understanding dawned. The color drained from both of their faces as they read about Lucala's plan to gradually distance himself from me after our marriage. his intention to move Mila into our household as a temporary arrangement that would become permanent, his belief that I was too naive and devoted to ever question his choices. He wrote this? His mother whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, settling back into my chair with the satisfaction of someone finally telling the truth. There are 63 entries about Mila spanning for years. Only 7 mention me, and most of those are complaints about the engagement or speculation about how to manage both relationships without losing either. The sound of sirens outside grew louder, more urgent. But the drama unfolding in our living room had become far more compelling than the one across the street. I watched as her parents grappled with the realization that they had been orchestrating a wedding between a woman in love and a man obsessed with someone else. Elena, my mother said carefully, how did you know where to find these things? It was a fair question, and one I had prepared for. I've suspected for months, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. The way he talks about her, the way his eyes light up when someone mentions her name, the way he finds excuses to visit her apartment. I wanted to believe I was imagining things. But today, I gestured toward the window where smoke was still pouring from Mila's building. Today made everything clear. Lucala's father had found another entry, this one more recent, and his face was grim as he read aloud. Elena agreed to the Christmas party at Mila's place. She has no idea that I've been in love with the hostess for years. Sometimes I think it would be kinder to tell her the truth. But her family has been so generous to mine, and the business partnership means everything to my father. I'm a coward, but I'm a practical coward. The words hung in the air like an indictment. I had heard them before, in my previous life, when I had discovered the diary during one of my desperate searches for understanding. Why did my husband spend more time with his ward than with his wife? Why did he light up around her in ways he never did with me? Why did I feel like a stranger in my own marriage? This time, I didn't have to carry that burden of discovery alone. So, I said into the silence, my voice steady and calm, I think we can all agree that this engagement was a mistake. Lucalo has made his choice, and it wasn't me. Through the window, we could see him emerging from the building with a figure in his arms. Even at this distance, even through the smoke and chaos, his body language told the story. The way he held her, the way he seemed to shield her from the world, the way he looked down at her face, it was the tenderness of a man who had found his purpose. I felt a strange sense of peace watching them. In my previous life, I had stood at this same window and felt my heart break as I realized I was witnessing something I could never compete with. This time, I felt only relief. The pretense was over. The lies were exposed. The choice had been made publicly and definitively. She's beautiful, I said conversationally, nodding toward the drama unfolding across the street. And she clearly brings out something in him that I never could. Lucalo's mother was crying now, quiet tears of shame and confusion. Elena, we had no idea. If we had known, what would you have done differently? I asked, and it wasn't an accusation, just genuine curiosity. Would you have canceled the engagement? Would you have encouraged him to pursue her instead? Would you have been honest with my family about where his heart really belonged? The questions hung unanswered because we all knew the truth. Social expectations, business partnerships, family obligations, they had all conspired to create this elaborate charade. I had been cast as the suitable wife while Mila played the tragic figure, who would consume my husband's heart and ultimately his soul. But not this time. This time, I stood up from the sofa and smoothed down my engagement dress for the last time. I'm calling off the engagement, I announced, and the words felt like liberation. Lucalo has made it clear where his priorities lie, and I refuse to spend my life competing with a ghost. The paramedics were loading Mila into an ambulance now. Lucalo climbing in beside her despite the protests of the medical team. Even from our vantage point, his devotion was unmistakable. He had found his damsel in distress, And I was finally free of the obligation to pretend I didn't notice. Elena, please, his father said desperately. Let us talk to him. Let us explain. Explain what? I interrupted. That he should marry me despite being in love with someone else. That I should be grateful for half a heart and stolen moments. That I should spend the next 30 years wondering why I'm never enough. The number 30 slipped out before I could stop it, but no one seemed to notice. They were too busy processing their own guilt and shocked to question my certainty about the timeline. I moved to the door, suddenly desperate for fresh air, for space, for distance from the wreckage of other people's expectations. I'll be staying with my aunt for a few days while we sort out the details, I announced. Please give Lucalu my best wishes for Milla's recovery. The irony wasn't lost on me in my previous life. Milla's recovery had been slow and painful, her beauty permanently altered by the fire. She had milked every moment of suffering for maximum sympathy, and Lucalu had been her devoted nurse, leaving me to rattle around our empty house like a forgotten ornament. This time, I wouldn't be around to watch the performance. I walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind the stunned silence of our families and the remnants of a future that had never truly been mine. The air outside was thick with smoke and possibility. And for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, or perhaps for the first time into lifetimes, I could breathe freely. The next few weeks unfolded like a fever dream of liberation. News of our broken engagement spread through our social circle with the velocity of wildfire, carrying with it whispered speculation and barely concealed schadenfreude. I had expected judgment, had prepared myself for the social consequences of calling off such a prominent match. But instead I found something I hadn't anticipated. Respect. Other women, it seemed, had been watching my relationship with Lucalu more closely than I had realized. They had seen what I had been too naive to notice: the way his attention wandered, the way he spoke about Mila, the way he seemed more invested in her well-being than in our future together. My decisive action in ending the engagement was viewed not as impulsive or cruel, but as admirably self-aware. I always wondered how you could stand it, confided Mrs. Nakamura during a chance encounter at the market. The way he looked at that girl, like she hung the moon and you were just there. Her words stung with their casual brutality, but they also validated everything I had experienced in my previous life. The loneliness, the confusion, the constant feeling of competing with a memory. It hadn't been my imagination. It had been real, and others had seen it too. I threw myself into rebuilding my life with the manic energy of someone who had been given a second chance. My father's business had always fascinated me, but in my previous life, I had been expected to abandon such interests in favor of domestic pursuits. This time, I asked to be included in meetings, to learn the intricacies of import regulations and supply chain management, to understand the financial structures that had built our family's wealth. My father was initially bemused by my sudden interest, but he was also impressed by my quick grasp of complex concepts and my innovative suggestions for expanding into new markets. You have a head for this, he told me one evening as we reviewed quarterly projections. I wish I had recognized that sooner. The irony was delicious. In my previous life, Lucalu had gradually taken over many of my father's business responsibilities, positioning himself as the heir apparent while I played housewife to an absent husband. Now, with Lucalu out of the picture, that role was naturally falling to me. I was reviewing contracts in my father's study when my mother knocked on the door, with a peculiar expression on her face. "Elena, dear, there's someone here to see you." I looked up from the shipping manifests I had been analyzing, noting the careful way she had phrased the announcement. Not a friend or a visitor, just someone, which meant it was either Lucalu or someone representing his interests. I wasn't surprised to find Lucalu himself waiting in our formal sitting room, looking haggard and uncertain in a way I had never seen before. The confident, charming man I had fallen in love with had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely lost. Good, I thought with satisfaction. Let him experience a fraction of the confusion I had lived with for 30 years. He stood when I entered the room, his hands nervous at his sides, his usual easy smile nowhere to be found. Elena, thank you for seeing me. Of course, I replied coolly, settling into the chair across from him rather than the sofa where we had once sat together. The distance was deliberate, symbolic, and I could see him notice it. How is Milo recovering? The question clearly caught him off guard. He had probably expected accusations, demands for explanations, tears, drama, something that would allow him to play either the villain or the hero. Instead, I was offering polite concern for his beloved's well-being. She's doing well, he said carefully. The doctors say she'll make a full recovery. No permanent scarring. I smiled brightly. How wonderful for both of you. The silence that followed was excruciating, and I let it stretch until he was forced to fill it. This was his show now. Let him direct it. Elena, I owe you an explanation, he began, his voice carrying a weight of rehearsed sincerity. What happened on our engagement day was perfectly clear. I interrupted smoothly. You made a choice, and I respected it. What more explanation could I need? He blinked, clearly thrown off script. But the way I left, the way I ran to save the woman you love. I tilted my head, studying him with academic interest. Lucalu, you've never been subtle about your feelings for Mila. The only mystery is why you thought I didn't notice. His face went pale, then flushed red. Elena, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs with casual elegance. You've been in love with Mila Chen since childhood. You agreed to our engagement because it was socially advantageous, and because you thought you could manage both relationships simultaneously. You planned to marry me for the business connections, while keeping her as your emotional priority. Did I miss anything important? The accuracy of my summary left him speechless. I could practically see the gears turning as he tried to figure out how I had assembled such a complete picture of his motivations. In my previous life, it had taken me years to piece together the truth. Years of subtle clues and growing suspicions. This time, I had the luxury of certainty. The diary was quite illuminating. I added conversationally 63 entries about her over for years. Very thorough documentation of your feelings. His face went white as paper. You read I shared it with both our families, actually. They were as surprised as I was to learn about the depth of your attachment. I smiled sweetly. Your mother was particularly moved by the entry where you fantasized about my dying in a car accident so you could comfort Mila at my funeral. That entry had been one of the most painful discoveries in my previous life. Not because I believed he actually wanted me dead, but because it revealed how thoroughly I had become an obstacle to be removed, rather than a person to be loved. Lucalu buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been grief or relief or terror. Elena, I never meant for you to see those things. They were just thoughts, private thoughts. Thoughts that revealed your true feelings, I corrected. Thoughts that explained why you always seemed more excited about her birthday than our anniversary. Why you knew her favorite flowers but couldn't remember mine. Why you found excuses to visit her apartment but rarely seemed interested in spending time alone with me. Each observation landed like a physical blow, and I watched him flinch with each one. This was the conversation I should have had 30 years ago, before I wasted my life loving someone who was incapable of loving me back. I did care for you, he said quietly, and I could hear the truth in his voice. I do care for you. But Mila, she's been part of my life since we were children. She needs me in ways that you never would. I finished for him because I was raised to be independent and self-sufficient, while she was raised to be helpless and dependent. I understand the appeal. It must be intoxicating to be someone's entire world. He looked up at me with something that might have been hope, or might have been desperation. Then you understand why I had to choose her. Why I can't abandon her now, when she needs me most. I nodded thoughtfully. I do understand, which is why I'm not going to stand in your way. The relief on his face was almost comical in its intensity. He had come here expecting a battle, prepared for tears and recriminations and desperate attempts to win him back. Instead, I was handing him exactly what he wanted, permission to choose her, without guilt. Elena, you're incredible, he said, and for the first time in our conversation, he sounded like the charming man I had once fallen for. I knew you would understand. I knew you would be mature about this. I smiled, and it was genuine, because I was about to give him a gift he wouldn't appreciate until it was too late. Of course I understand, Lucalu. You're in love with a woman who needs constant rescue, constant attention, constant validation. That she's the center of your universe. And now you'll get to spend the rest of your life providing exactly that. Something in my tone must have warned him, because his expression began to shift from relief to uncertainty. What do you mean? I mean that you've gotten exactly what you wanted, I said, rising from my chair with fluid grace. Mila needs you completely. Now she'll be traumatized by the fire, probably afraid to be alone, certainly in need of extensive emotional support. As she recovers, you'll be her hero, her savior, her everything. Isn't that what you always dreamed of? Yes, he said slowly, as if sensing a trap. Yes, that's what I want. Perfect, I said, walking to the door. Then you should go to her. She's probably wondering where you are. He stood uncertainly, clearly expecting more from our conversation. Perhaps a dramatic farewell, or tears, or at least some acknowledgement of what we had shared. Instead, I opened the door and waited for him to leave. Elena, he said as he reached the threshold. I hope we can still be friends. I laughed, and the sound was bright and genuinely amused. Oh, Lucalu, I hope we can be strangers. The confusion on his face was the last thing I saw before I closed the door behind him, ending our chapter with the finality I should have insisted upon. Decades ago, I watched from the window as he walked down our front path, his shoulders set with determination, his pace quickening as he hurried back to his chosen life. He looked like a man who had narrowly escaped a trap, who had successfully negotiated his way out of an unwanted obligation. He had no idea that he was walking directly into the trap that would define the rest of his existence. Over the following months, I rebuilt my life with methodical precision, using the knowledge from my previous lifetime to make choices that had once seemed impossible. I threw myself into my father's business with newfound passion, expanding our operations into textile imports and establishing relationships with manufacturers across Asia. The work that had once intimidated me now felt natural, familiar, as if I was finally becoming the person I was meant to be. But I also kept careful track of Lucalu and Mila's story, watching their romance unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a predictable tragedy. The patterns were already emerging, exactly as I remembered them. Mila's recovery from the fire was slow and dramatic, punctuated by setbacks that always seemed to occur whenever Lucalu showed signs of returning to his normal life. A panic attack when he mentioned returning to work, a relapse when he suggested she might be ready to live independently again, a sudden fear of being alone that required his constant presence. My friend Sarah, who worked as a nurse at the hospital where Mila was being treated, provided regular updates with the gossipy enthusiasm of someone who had stumbled upon a real-life soap opera. She's got him completely wrapped around her finger, Sarah reported during one of our weekly lunches. The doctors say she's physically fine, but she keeps finding reasons to extend her stay. Yesterday, she claimed she was having nightmares about the fire, and he immediately ranged to sleep in the chair beside her bed. I listened with the patience of someone who had lived through this entire performance before. Mila was a master manipulator, skilled at presenting her neediness as romantic devotion and her emotional instability as tragic fragility. Lucalu, desperate to be needed, was the perfect victim for her particular brand of psychological warfare. It's actually quite brilliant, I mused, twirling my fork in my pasta. She's managed to turn her own reckless behavior into his lifelong obligation. Sarah looked at me curiously. You almost sound like you admire her. I admire efficiency, I replied. She identified what she wanted and implemented a strategy to get it. The fact that the strategy involved arson and emotional manipulation doesn't make it less effective. The casual way I mentioned arson caught Sarah's attention, and she leaned forward with interest. Arson? I thought the fire was accidental. I had spoken without thinking, forgetting that the investigation into the fire's cause hadn't been completed yet. In my previous life, it had taken months for investigators to determine that the blaze had started in Mila's apartment, due to negligent use of candles near flammable materials. The official report had been carefully worded to avoid the word intentional, but anyone who knew Mila understood that the fire had been a desperate bid for attention that had spiraled beyond her control. Just speculation, I said with a dismissive wave, but you have to admit, the timing was remarkably convenient. A damsel in distress on the very day her childhood sweetheart was getting engaged to someone else? It reads like a romance novel. Sarah laughed, but I could see the wheels turning. She was a smart woman, and she had worked enough emergency cases to recognize the patterns of attention-seeking behavior. I had planted the seed. Now I just had to wait for it to grow. The official engagement announcement came 6 months later, splashed across the society pages with the breathless enthusiasm reserved for particularly dramatic love stories. Local hero marries fire survivor, read the headline, accompanied by a photo of Lucalu gazing adoringly at Mila as she smiled wanly from her wheelchair, a prop she had been using for weeks despite having no physical need for it. I studied the photograph with professional interest, noting the way Mila positioned herself as the tragic centerpiece, while Lucalu hovered protectively beside her. Her wedding dress was ivory silk with long sleeves to hide the minor scarring on her arms, and she wore her hair swept to one side to cover the small patch where it had been singed. The overall effect was ethereally beautiful, romantically wounded, utterly captivating. The article painted their love story in sweeping, dramatic strokes, childhood sweethearts separated by duty, reunited by tragedy, bound together by his heroic rescue and her brave survival. There was no mention of the broken engagement that had made their union possible. No reference to the woman who had been cast aside to make room for this epic romance. I had been erased from their narrative as efficiently as if I had never existed. And I found that I was perfectly fine with that. My father found me reading the announcement in his study, where I had been working late on a particularly complex shipping contract. He glanced over my shoulder at the newspaper, his expression carefully neutral. Any regrets? He asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. In my previous life, seeing that photo would have devastated me. The confirmation that I had been so easily replaced, that their love story was being celebrated while my heartbreak was ignored, would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and bitterness that lasted for years. Now, I felt only a profound sense of satisfaction. They looked perfect together, the devoted hero and his beautiful victim, locked in a dance of codependency that would consume them both. Lucalu would spend the rest of his life trying to heal wounds that Mila had no intention of letting heal. She would spend the rest of hers creating new crises that required his devoted attention. They deserved each other in the most literal sense. None, I said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. They're going to be very happy together. My father heard the irony in my voice and smiled. You've changed, Elena. Since the engagement ended, you've become sharper, more focused. I've become myself, I corrected. For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be what someone else needs me to be. He nodded approvingly. It suits you. and the Nakamura contract. Signed this morning, I replied, allowing myself a small smile of triumph. 3-year exclusive deal, 30% above market rate. They were impressed with our efficiency projections. The Nakamura deal was something I had only dreamed of in my previous life. A partnership that Lucalu had failed to secure despite multiple attempts. This time, armed with knowledge of their exact requirements and timeline, I had crafted a proposal that was impossible to refuse. It felt like justice served cold and perfectly seasoned. The months that followed blurred together in a symphony of professional achievement and personal growth, while Lucalu struggled with his new role as perpetual caretaker to a woman whose needs seemed to multiply by the day. I was building an empire. The business expanded rapidly under my direction, branching into new markets, establishing crucial partnerships, accumulating the kind of wealth and influence that would have taken decades to achieve through traditional means. But I also made time to observe the slow-motion car crash of their marriage, not out of cruelty, but out of scientific curiosity. I needed to confirm that the patterns I remembered from my previous life would repeat themselves, that my knowledge of their future was accurate and reliable. And oh, how perfectly it all unfolded. Within a year of their wedding, Lucalu looked like a man aged by decades rather than months. Mila's needs had evolved from physical recovery to emotional dependency, to complete psychological control. She couldn't sleep alone, couldn't eat if he wasn't present, couldn't make the simplest decisions without his input. Every attempt he made to reclaim pieces of his independence was met with a crisis. That required his immediate and total attention. Sarah continued to provide updates from her position at the hospital, where Mila had become a frequent visitor with an endless array of mysterious ailments that never quite warranted serious medical intervention, but always required extensive testing and observation. She was in again yesterday, Sarah reported during one of our lunches. Chest pains this time. All the tests came back normal, but she insisted on staying overnight for observation. He slept in the chair beside her bed, just like old times. I nodded, remembering this exact pattern from my previous life. Mila had learned that medical emergencies were the one thing that could reclaim Lucalu's complete attention whenever he showed signs of establishing boundaries or pursuing interests outside of their relationship. And how does he seem? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Exhausted, frustrated, like a man who's drowning but keeps getting pulled back under every time he reaches for the surface. Sarah paused, studying my face. You really dodged a bullet with that one, didn't you? I dodged a lifetime sentence, I corrected, and meant every word. The final confirmation of my predictions came 2 years after their wedding, when my mother mentioned seeing Lucalu at the pharmacy, picking up prescriptions for anxiety medication and sleeping pills. Not for Mila, but for himself. The devoted husband was cracking under the pressure of being someone's entire world, exactly as I had watched him do in my previous life. But this time, I wasn't there to witness his gradual decline firsthand. This time, I was free to build my own empire while he disappeared into the quicksand of his chosen martyrdom. The ultimate irony came 5 years after our broken engagement, when Lucalu appeared at my office building, looking like a ghost of his former self. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant announced his arrival, and I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the reckoning, the acknowledgement, the final proof that I had chosen correctly. He stood in my doorway like a man approaching an altar, his once confident posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone who had spent years carrying an impossible weight. His hair was graying at the temples, his face lined with premature age, his eyes holding the hollow exhaustion of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to make decisions for himself. Elena, he said, and his voice carried the weight of everything he had lost. I was hoping we could talk. I gestured to the chair across from my mahogany desk-up position that placed him as supplicant, rather than equal. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. Of course. How is Mila? The question hit him like a physical blow, and I watched him struggle to find an answer that wouldn't sound like a confession of defeat. She's having a difficult time lately. The anniversary of the fire always affects her badly, but this year, he trailed off, unable to articulate what I already knew. This year, Mila had attempted suicide as the ultimate manipulation tactic, a desperate bid to reclaim his attention after he had dared to suggest that she might benefit from professional counseling. The attempt had been carefully calculated, dramatic enough to terrify him, but safe enough to ensure survival. It was vintage Mila, and utterly predictable. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said with perfect sincerity. "It must be very difficult for both of you." He looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I leaned back in my chair, curious to see where this conversation would lead. "I'm listening." "That day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "our engagement day, when I left to save her, did you somehow know that it would lead to this?" The question hung in the air between us like a blade suspended by a thread. He was asking if I had possessed some supernatural insight into the consequences of his choice, if I had deliberately allowed him to walk into the trap that had consumed his life. I could have told him the truth that I had lived through 30 years of their toxic marriage, that I had died alone and forgotten while he played devoted saint to his damaged angel, that I had been reborn into that moment with perfect knowledge of what his choice would cost us all. I could have explained about the diary I had discovered, the patterns I had recognized, the inevitable trajectory of loving someone who was incapable of being loved, without consuming everything around her. Instead, I smiled and gave him the answer that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "I knew," I said simply, "that you were choosing her over me, and I knew that I deserved better than being someone's second choice." His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might actually cry. "But if you had stopped me, if you had fought for us, then you would have resented me for the rest of our lives," I finished. "You would have spent 30 years wondering what might have been with her, and I would have spent 30 years competing with a ghost I could never defeat." The accuracy of my prediction clearly shook him, because these were obviously thoughts he had entertained during his darkest moments. The grass is always greener, and he had spent years wondering if he had made the wrong choice, if he had traded a peaceful life for a dramatic one. "She needs me," he said, but it sounded more like a mantra than a declaration. "She can't function without me." "I know," I replied. "That's exactly what you wanted, isn't it? To be someone's entire world?" The truth of it broke something inside him, and I watched years of suppressed regret come flooding to the surface. "I thought it would feel different," he whispered. "Being needed that completely. I thought it would feel like love. What does it feel like instead?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, like drowning. I nodded, unsurprised. "Love shouldn't feel like drowning, Lucalu. Love should feel like flying." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw him take in the changes that 5 years had wrought. The confidence in my posture, the success radiating from every carefully chosen detail of my office, the peace that came from living authentically rather than performing for someone else's approval. I was everything he had lost and everything he would never have. "You're happy," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm free," I corrected, which amounts to the same thing. He stood to leave, moving like a man carrying chains. At the door, he turned back one final time. "Elena, I know," I said gently, sparing him the futile gesture of apology. "But it doesn't matter anymore. You made your choice, and I made mine." We both got exactly what we deserved. After he left, I sat in my office as the sun set over the city I was helping to rebuild through strategic investments and innovative partnerships. My phone buzzed with messages from potential business partners. My calendar was filled with meetings. that would shape the economic landscape for years to come. And my personal life was rich with friendships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. In 2 months, I would meet Kenji Tanaka at a trade conference in Tokyo, a brilliant architect whose company was revolutionizing sustainable building design. In 6 months, we would be inseparable partners in both business and life. In 2 years, we would marry in a ceremony celebrated by people who genuinely wished us well. In 5 years, we would welcome our first child, a daughter who would inherit my business acumen and his creative vision. But I knew none of that as I sat in my office that evening, watching the city lights flicker to life. I only knew that I had been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance to live authentically, rather than apologetically. Lucalu would spend the rest of his life trapped in the prison of his own choosing, bound to a woman whose love was indistinguishable from possession. He would grow old before his time, his dreams sacrificed on the altar of someone else's bottomless need for validation. And when he died decades earlier than he should have, worn down by years of emotional warfare disguised as devotion, Mila would collapse dramatically at his funeral, playing the grieving widow with the same theatrical flair she had brought to every crisis of their marriage. But that would be his story, not mine. I had already lived through that ending once, and I had no intention of witnessing it again. Instead, I would build something beautiful with someone who understood that love should enhance your life rather than consume it. I would create wealth and influence and lasting impact. I would raise children who understood their own worth and would never accept scraps of affection disguised as devotion. I would live fully, authentically, joyfully, not in spite of the betrayal that had once destroyed me, but because of it. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the revelation of their true nature. Lucalu had shown me exactly who he was on our engagement day, and I had finally been wise enough to believe him. As I gathered my papers and prepared to leave the office, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at me was strong, successful, and utterly at peace with her choices. She bore no resemblance to the broken, confused woman who had died alone in a hospital bed, abandoned by the man she had loved unconditionally. That woman was gone, erased by the flames that had consumed more than just a building. In her place stood someone who had learned the most valuable lesson life could teach: that the greatest act of love is sometimes knowing when to let go. The engagement ring I had once worn was long gone, sold, and the money donated to a women's shelter. But sometimes, on nights like this, I could still feel its phantom weight on my finger, not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as a symbol of what I had been brave enough to refuse. I had been reborn on our engagement day, when my fiancé ran into the fire for his first love. And this time, I had let him burn while I finally learned to fly.